Have you ever wondered what it was like to fly 30 or 40 years ago? We're not just talking about the ticket price or the elegant uniforms of the flight attendants, but about a completely different world up there, at 10,000 meters high. There were things that today would seem unthinkable, absurd, or even dangerous, but at the time they were part of the routine. So let's get started. Can you imagine getting on a plane today and the passenger next to you lights up a cigarette right after takeoff? It seems unthinkable, but it was normal for decades. It was allowed and institutionalized. Airplanes from the 60s, 70s, and even part of the 80s came equipped with ashtrays at every seat and illuminated signs that said no smoking and smoking allowed, depending on the phase of the flight. Smoking was part of the travel ritual, of the modern and elegant lifestyle. Airline advertisements even portrayed it as something glamorous. People in suits, a glass of wine in one hand and a cigarette in the other, crossing the ocean with total distinction. And although it seems absurd to us today, there was no scientific consensus on the effects of secondhand smoke. It was normal for non-smokers to simply endure it, as if it were a small price to pay for the privilege of flying. But then, what changed? Everything started to crack in the 1980s, when research on the harm of passive smoke began to generate public pressure. Complaints from non-smoking passengers grew, flight attendant unions began to demand healthier working conditions, and governments finally listened. In 1988, the United States took the first significant step. It banned smoking on domestic flights of less than 2 hours. It was a turning point. Gradually, the restriction extended to longer flights and later to international flights. Europe, Asia, and Latin America followed the same path during the 1990s. And today, lighting a cigarette inside an airplane is not only scandalous, it's a federal crime in many countries. Even so, traces of that past remain. Some airplanes still have ashtrays on the bathroom doors. No smoking signs still light up, even though no one questions it. And on certain flights, especially in Asian countries, you'll see that smoking seats still exist, but only as a relic of the past. Curiously, it wasn't the health damage that ultimately convinced the airlines. It was the money. The smoke damaged the ventilation systems, permeated the cabin materials, and increased cleaning and maintenance costs. Complaints also affected the customer experience. It was a mix of factors, but public image and profitability weighed more than science, at least at the beginning. Today, an airplane cabin is one of the most protected spaces in the world. Locked, armored, monitored. But there was a time, not so long ago, when you could go in to greet the pilot, mid-flight. And no, it wasn't an exception or a special privilege. It was something common, especially for children. In fact, many airlines offered a cockpit tour as part of the flying experience, a way to inspire vocations and build trust in the crew. Even at the end of the flight, the little ones would receive an honorary pilot badge as a keepsake. Do you remember? There was a feeling of closeness, of humanity in the flights. The pilot wasn't a distant and silent figure, he was the captain of the ship, and you were invited to see his part. Bridge. So, what changed? Police turrets. Everything changed on September 11, 2001. That day, the world understood that air security was much more fragile than believed. For commercial planes were hijacked and used as weapons. Unrestricted access to the cockpit became one of the main factors of vulnerability. Vulnerability factors. Since then, the rules changed radically. Cockpit doors began to be reinforced with bulletproof materials. Double verification systems were installed for access. And most importantly, entry was completely restricted during the flight, without exception, even for other passengers or unauthorized personnel. Even school visits to the airport, where children could enter the cockpit and touch the simulated controls, disappeared for years. Fear was stronger than nostalgia. And although the world has changed, many people who experienced that still remember it fondly. It was a symbol of a time when flying was almost a magical adventure, not a militarized operation. And today, well, unless you are part of the crew or have very special authorization, no one can enter the cockpit during a flight, not even to take a photo. And yet, that memory remains etched in the collective memory. Because entering the cockpit wasn't just about seeing buttons and levers, it was about feeling part of the journey, trusting the person taking you through the sky. There was a time when going to the airport was almost like taking an intercity bus. You didn't have to arrive hours in advance, there weren't long lines to go through X-rays, and no one scrutinized your luggage. Literally, you could carry almost anything. Knives, yes, glass perfume bottles, of course, lighters, Swiss Army knives, soda cans, aerosols. All of that was perfectly legal and common. Airport security was much more relaxed, and the concept of air risk wasn't present in the collective imagination. Trust was above control. Imagine this, you boarded the plane with your carry-on luggage and no one put it through a scanner. At most, they would give you a superficial, almost perfunctory check. There were no liquid or milliliter limits, nor did they make you take out your laptop or shoes at an inspection point. The change was gradual, but there were two key moments that accelerated everything. 1. The Lockerbie bombing, 1988. A Pan Am plane exploded in the air due to a bomb hidden in checked luggage. Captured. It was a before and after moment. From then on, more advanced X-ray scanners began to be implemented, but what you carried in your hand was still not regulated. 2. The September 11th attacks, 2001. That day changed everything. The attackers used sharp objects and common tools that went unnoticed by security. Since then, authorities understood that danger could come in any form. That's when the limit we all know today was born. A maximum of 100 milliliters per container, all in a transparent bag. The reason was not arbitrary. In 2006, an attack in the United Kingdom was thwarted that planned to use liquid explosives disguised in beverage bottles. Since then, that restriction became global. And although for many passengers these measures are annoying or exaggerated, there is something we must always keep in mind. Every security rule at airports is written in blood. Nothing is there by accident. Today, going through security control, it may seem like a hassle, taking off your belt, opening your suitcase, throwing away the bottle of water you just bought. But all of that has a story behind it, and sometimes, that story saved lives. Today, as soon as you take your seat on the plane, a kind but firm voice reminds you, please, put your phone in airplane mode. And we all do it without thinking. It's part of the routine. But did you know that this mode didn't exist before the 2000s? And that for a long time, no one knew for sure if cell phones really interfered with the plane? During the 80s and 90s, mobile phones started to become more and more difficult to find. They began to become more common, but there were no conclusive studies on their effect on air navigation systems. So the airlines opted for something prudent, banning their use during the flight as a precaution, even though there was never a documented case of an accident caused by it. And here's where it gets interesting. At that time, many passengers used them anyway. Some would turn on their cell phones right after takeoff to check if they had a signal. Others carried CD players, cassettes, portable radios, and even walkie-talkies without any problem. And the boldest ones would answer calls before the plane had completely touched down. The cabin crew used to ask passengers to turn off electronic devices, but the measure was more protocol than effective. There was no tool to verify if you actually did it. It was basically an act of good faith. So, when did the famous airplane mode appear? It was with the arrival of smartphones that manufacturers began to include a feature that deactivates the entire communication system, all wireless connections without turning off the device. The goal was to allow passengers to use the phone for other things, like viewing photos, listening to music, or playing games, without posing a theoretical risk to air safety. This mode became so popular that today it is on absolutely all cell phones, tablets, smartwatches, laptops, even if it is no longer as necessary as before. And that's because modern airplanes are better shielded against interference. In fact, many airlines already offer onboard Wi-Fi, allow the use of Bluetooth with headphones, and are even conducting pilot tests to make airplane mode optional in the future. But then, is it really dangerous not to use airplane mode? The short answer is, not as much as was previously believed, but it can still cause annoying interference in communication between the cockpit and the control tower, especially if many devices are active. Even though the systems are safer, the rule remains to turn off wireless connections. And, let's be honest, a couple of hours without notifications, without emails, without calls, doesn't really hurt anyone, right? Today, if a passenger starts behaving aggressively or erratically, the first suspicion is that they're drunk, and that puts the crew on immediate alert. But a few decades ago, that wasn't a problem. It was part of the experience. In the 70s, 80s, and even part of the 90s, drinking alcohol during the flight was a social ritual. There was no limit on consumption. You could bring your own bottles from the ground. And if you felt like it, you could even open a wine, a whiskey, or a rum at your seat without the crew's permission. It was part of the glamour of flying. Glass after glass, passengers toasted as if they were at a wedding, but 10,000 meters in the air. Anything goes with alcoholic drinks. In business or first class, the bar service was practically unlimited. And in economy class, although it was more basic, it was still free on most airlines, especially on long flights. Can you imagine today a passenger serving themselves a double whiskey from their own flask? Back then, it wasn't just acceptable, it was accepted. It was normal. And although most of the time nothing happened, problems began to accumulate. Drunk passengers who didn't respect the flight attendants. Fights between travelers over absurd reasons. Medical emergencies due to intoxication. Even attempts to open the airplane door mid-flight under the influence of alcohol. The straw that broke the camel's back. As incidents increased, airlines began to tighten their policies. Not out of moralism, but for safety and reputation. The image of a drunk passenger shouting, or vomiting was not compatible with the quality service that brands wanted to offer. Thus, the first changes arrived. Prohibition of consuming alcohol brought from home. Limitation of drinks per passenger. Special training for the crew in handling intoxicated passengers. And in many cases, total restriction of service on short or domestic flights. Today, alcohol consumption on board depends on the airline and the duration of the flight. Some offer drinks, but with strict control. Others have opted to eliminate it completely. And if you try to open your own bottle during the flight, you may be fined or even banned from future bookings. A necessary change, although uncomfortable for some. The debate remains open. There are those who defend the right to enjoy a drink while traveling, and those who argue that the sky is not a floating bar, but an environment where everyone should feel safe. The truth is that the absolute freedom that existed before no longer has a place in a world where any incident can go viral in seconds and where collective safety is not an issue. It is above individual pleasures.